Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to start your gardening week. And I'm excited about this. I dropped a few hints last week that we were going to have a special guest on the show today. And for about the next hour, we can answer your questions together with me and Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel on YouTube. Hi, Tony. Great to have you back on the show.
Hey, Scott. Hey, everybody. How are you doing?
Now, I love talking with Tony, and we chat a lot and email and really are good buddies. But the main reason today is because of this. Tony wrote another book, Your First Vegetable Garden, and I don't want to be too critical, but I think you might have misnamed it because I think this book is appropriate for your first vegetable garden and your vegetable garden in your second year and third year and fourth year. There is so much information in this book that it really goes beyond just your first vegetable garden. So as you were writing this, I know you pack your YouTube videos full of information. What was your thinking as far as what you wanted to present to gardeners out there?
So I wanted to produce a book that was aimed at new people, but wasn't basic. Because what I find is when people are, when you get your first books and as a new vegetable grower, you get in there and sometimes like the information's really lacking because there might be a paragraph on one thing or a couple of lines on another, and you don't really get any information that you can put into practice in the garden. And I didn't want that. So the idea behind the book was so that someone could get this book, go through walking through it month by month, and will literally follow everything that's in the book, and will be able to produce the garden, sow the seed, grow the vegetables, harvest the vegetables, save the seed, and get the garden ready for the following year, and keep it all timed properly. So that, because I think timing is one of the biggest issues for new people and knowing what to do.
Sure.
But what I didn't want to do was produce a book that was basic and, like, for argument's sake, just saying, oh, put compost on the ground or whatever, but not give any sort of feedback on what compost is and why you do it and this, that, and the other. So there is quite a lot of detail in the book, even though it's your first vegetable garden. It's not a basic growing book, if you get my drift.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's one of the things I really like about it. I've got dozens and dozens of new gardener books that I bought years ago, and I buy them now just to compare to see if maybe I missed something. And so many of the books are exactly that. They're build a bed, put compost on the soil, add mulch, and it's very simplistic. But you go, I don't think I've ever seen a beginning gardener book that talks as much as you do about compost, that talks so much about soil. As you know, I think soil is the key in the garden. And you're talking about the nutrients, you're talking about the cation exchanges, and that's why I say it goes beyond just a first year gardener book.
Yeah,
It really can
I
be
mean,
used.
when you think about it though, Scott, when you get into something, you can have a basic understanding, and like the basic books, again, like you say, put compost on, put mulch on, but you only know what to do with mulch if you know what to do with mulch. And the problem is with a lot of people, they probably haven't even been exposed to mulch before, so
Oh, sure.
what do I use as mulch? When do I put it on? So that's why I go into in depth with things. And the idea is your first vegetable garden, you're better off setting the foundations right and understanding what you're doing, because it'll give you a better result at the end and further into your gardening career. And that way you're setting yourself up. It's like anything else. You build a house on shoddy foundations, it's not going to stand for very long. And what I didn't want to do was produce a book that could potentially put people off gardening, because I'm here to help people to garden and fall in love with gardening. And if I'm not giving them the information, like we are saying about compost, putting compost in the garden, and they go and buy store-bought compost that is not very good, put it on the garden, they don't get the results they were expecting or that the book was telling them they would get, and then they give up because of the information they had just wasn't adequate. So that's what I didn't want to do. I wanted a book that, although is probably more in depth than it may need be for some things, the information's there if people want to know it.
Well, and I would encourage, especially new gardeners, this is a good book, and you're right. So much of the information is more than they need as a first-time gardener, but it's definitely a resource. I think once you start gardening, as you know, and you start making mistakes and things start going wrong, you can go back and figure out what it was that went wrong, because you're explaining the why to do mulch and the different types of mulch, more than just put mulch in. And then the second half of the book are all the individual plants.
Yeah.
And then you cover how to do so. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, of how you've laid out the actual section that tells how to care for the plants?
Yeah, I mean the book's laid out as if you're starting your very first year, setting your garden up, talks all about structure in the garden, why we put things in certain places within the garden, for later on in the year. We talk about being able to put the watering systems around the garden in the right areas, and it's all about planning initially, and then you go from there. And even right to in the end of the book, we have a month by month calendar of jobs to do. So if anybody's ever struggling what they need to do for that particular month, is they flick to the back, they go, oh look, it's March here, this is what I need to be doing now. And so that just makes life that little bit easier for the new person, because even experienced gardeners sometimes go, what do I need to be doing today? It's we're in the middle of June, when do I need to start sowing for winter? And and it's stuff like this that a new gardener wouldn't be thinking of, but it's there in black and white. All they've got to do is turn to the appropriate pages,
So here's a quick question from Serena. I use biochar in my beds. In fact, I just added some biochar to a new bed I'm filling. And so the question is, if I used biochar in my raised beds last year, do I need to use it in the same beds this year?
No. Biochar will last for years. And if you've put a good amount of biochar in the bed initially, I mean, it's carbon at the end of the day, and it's going to last you quite a number of years. And then you only need to put small amounts just to top it back up. Then like down, I would probably just top it up every 3 or 4 years. But
I've noticed that mine redistributes a little bit as I transplant and weed, and so I agree with you. It's a one-time application, but every 3 or 4 or 5 years, just add a little bit more, because it will vary through the bed as you're growing different plants in the bed. But just one time. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And so Moondust has a question. I started my tomatoes, lettuce, and kale at the beginning of March, and my tomatoes are doing kind of fine, but my lettuce and kale not so much. Should I try and restart them?
It can be. It's been a bit of a funny year, to be honest with you, because a lot of people have been saying they've been having problems with tomatoes and stuff. But lettuce and kale, it depends how you're keeping them. They prefer cooler conditions. So if you're keeping them in the greenhouse and it's getting hot in there, you might want to put them into a cold frame or something. That might kick them off, to grow better. Now, you haven't really said whether or not they've germinated and they're just not growing well, or whether you're having problems germinating them. If you're having problems germinating, it might be down to the seed or the compost there, so you need to look at that. But if you've got other things growing well in the compost, then it's probably down to seed, and you might want to just give it a bit longer. But if it's growth, then there are a number of things, but probably heat. If your tomatoes are growing fine, and I'm assuming they were sown in the same sort of compost, then the likelihood is maybe they're getting a bit too warm.
Yeah, and especially with lettuce, it grows so quickly.
Yeah,
I think you can spend as much time trying to fix a problem with your lettuce.
Just resow it,
and by the time you would have fixed the first problem, that second sowing actually works pretty quickly, and you can get to a harvest without too much trouble.
Yeah.
And so had a question from Kay. Do you put fireplace ashes in the compost pile?
Right, Kay. If the only time you put ash in the compost pile is if it came from hardwood logs or anything like that. So if you're burning wood ash, wood in your fireplace, then you can put that as long as it's hardwood, not pines and things like that. Okay. But if it's like coal or sort of like these compressed tubes you can buy now to burn, if it's that sort of stuff, I would stay away from putting that ash in your garden. Just stick to hardwood ash.
Yeah, and I have a different problem when it comes to adding ash. My soil is so alkaline, and ash will raise the
Oil raise.
pH that
Yeah.
as you know, compost will tend to buffer the pH when you add alkaline or acidic materials to it. But for me, with an alkaline soil to
Yeah,
start
it wouldn't
with,
be good.
I just avoid wood ashes
And this
completely.
reverts back to the section in the book about testing your soils as well. That comes before planting anything, about testing the soil, and we talk about the pH and the importance of that for the plants you're growing. And again, sort of I talk about ways of raising and lowering the pH.
Yeah,
And that's quite important. If you were growing blueberries, for argument's sake, and you go and put fireplace ash on those blueberries, that
it's
pH
not
is
going to
going to
work.
spike, and they're going to just really, really let you know they're not happy. So
That's a good point. So you've been gardening for a long time, and you have had your channel for a long time, and now you're starting to get into being an author of some fantastic books. How consistent have you been? Are there plants that you were growing in your very first gardens that you're now growing now? And so for someone who gets your book, and even for those of us who have been gardening and get your book, what are you doing the same now that you were doing when you first started all those years ago?
do you know, the great thing about gardening is once you learn the fundamentals, because they never change, then you can tweak things, but like as far as plants are going, I'm still growing all the same stuff. Every year I try something new. Like a couple of years back, probably about 10 years ago, it was ochre, and okra and things like that. And then it became like Jerusalem artichokes, them as sunchokes. So, every year I'll try something new, and I'll test it with my family to see not if I can grow it, but if they enjoy eating it.
Right.
Because it doesn't matter how big a garden you got, you you will still fill it, and you want to give that space to the vegetables that you're going to eventually eat. If you're not going to enjoy eating it, then that space is a waste of space and energy and resources to grow something that you're not going to eat. So for everybody, I'd suggest you look at what you're eating, and then you prioritize where you're growing specific crops. So your blueberries, by soil testing, you know where the best place to put them if you're not going to grow them in a container, because you can find the lowest pH, so acidic soils
Right.
within the garden. That'll be the best place to sow because it's a naturally low pH
pH.
soil area. So it's no good putting them somewhere else, adjusting the soil, and because over time that soil will buffer the pH back to neutral and then eventually start climbing high again if it was an alkaline soil in the first place. So there's little things like this that you sort of you learn as you go. But as far as like, funny enough, Tina and I were looking back on an old video of me and the kids back in 2013, so 10 years ago, and they were running around with little wheelbarrows and stuff. We were looking at that today, and in there, I'm planting out pretty much it was all raised beds back then, mind, but I was planting out pretty much all the same things
Okay.
that we are now, but it was in a different garden to where we are now.
Yeah,
But yeah,
absolutely.
the fundamentals, the important part. And that's why I've gone into so much depth in the book, is get those fundamentals right, and it doesn't matter what you decide to do. Then you can experiment with things then, because you've got a baseline, and if you experiment and something doesn't work, you can revert back to the baseline. And I
Absolutely.
think that's the important thing. Gardeners should be experimenting because and testing the boundaries around their growing areas, because we all have microclimates. All of our gardens are different in soil structure, pH and the conditions around us. So you find your basic level, your balance level, and then you can work away from that and test and see if you can stretch that little boundary. And if you can, that becomes your new baseline, and then you move again. So like a couple of years ago, I've been growing bananas in my polytunnel. I
Oh,
haven't gone
wow.
to fruit yet, but the bananas are still growing. And I'm in South Wales, one of the wettest and coldest places in the UK. But I'm
Nice.
attempting and pushing to try and grow bananas, you know?
I'm not that brave yet, but you never know. Maybe someday here in Colorado I can try a
Don't get
banana.
me wrong, I could probably do it with heat, right?
Oh, sure.
But I
Yeah.
don't want
No,
to be manipulating that. I want to try and keep
no,
it
I think
as
that's
natural as you can.
amazing.
And again, like I said, if I lose the plant, in fact, I've got one down here because every year they throw up pups. I always pull one back. It comes in here and I can go and grab it now. It's literally down by there. And that comes here. So if I lose them up in the garden, I've always got that
You
backup
got
to
more.
continue going. The baseline is this room at the moment.
That's good. And so here's one of those where you can maybe push the limits a little bit from Karen in Thunder Bay in zone 3, which is very cold. I was checking germination of my lettuce seed and no germination happened multiple times. How long does lettuce seed stay viable? Do you know that one off the top of your head?
So lettuce seed is pretty good, actually. It'll stay
Yeah.
viable for quite a long period. And you can just do some tests. Get some wet kitchen paper, kitchen roll paper, and put some seed on there and just put it on a kitchen windowsill and just see if any of them germinate. You know, just say put out sort of like 10 or 20 seed and it'll give you a percentage on your germination. So at least then you'll be able to count how many seeds are germinated out of those 10. So if 8 of them counted, you know you've got an 80% germination rate, and then you can go and sow an extra 20% more on what you need, you know, for the seeds that you want. So if you wanted 20, then you're better off like sowing 30 or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But doing test germinations is a good thing. But lettuce seed, you know, I've been sowing my own seed, granted, you know, for the last 4 years, and I'm still sowing seed from 4 years ago, and it's still coming up, and I'm getting more or less 80-90% germination on it. But you don't know. This is the issue that you have with store-bought seed. You don't know how long it's been sat in warehouses for, and it may
Yeah.
say or packaged in 2023, but it may have been sat in a sack since 2018, and this is
Yeah.
the issue with that. Then, you know, so test germination is, you know, put it on a bit of paper on a windowsill, or, you know, cover it over with another piece of paper and just see how that goes, or close the tub off so it keeps that humidity up. All you want to do is see a sprout. It's not like you're trying to grow these plants, you know.
Yeah. And so Betty Barnes is saying my lettuce seed didn't last 3 years. I
Wow.
think storage is a big
Yeah.
component as well.
Yeah.
Cool, dark, dry. I've actually got some basil, or for you basil seed that's growing, or plants. They're actually now, and if you look at the recommendation, it'll say that the basil seed lasts up to 5 years.
Yeah.
And I had almost 100% germination from 7-year-old seed. And so, it's all about how you store it. And you're right, how old the seed was when you get it. But if you're not getting effective germination at all, it's probably old seed or the seed died. And it's like the lettuce. You just start over again. You get new seed
When
and go
when I
forward.
took over one part of the garden last year, when I took all the sheds and stuff down, there was a pot of cobra seed in there, and the date on them was 2012. And before I threw them out, literally last week, I did a test germination, and it still had 50% germination from 2012. And these are
Mhm.
bean seeds. It's so just do that test germination, and you just never know. And when you think about it, that's why in the book I cover about storage of seed, collecting your seed, storing your seed, and everything else, because the way you store seed is really important, and the temperatures they kept at. A lot of people put them in a drawer in the house. It's way too warm to be storing seed like that, so they are going to lose viability at that point.
Yeah, and I know gardeners as well. I just got my greenhouse set up last year, and a lot of gardeners think, "Oh, I've got my greenhouse. I'll store my pots in there. I'll store my compost
On
in
the
there,
shelf in the greenhouse.
and I'll store my seeds in there." And that's like
Yeah,
the worst spot that you can store your seeds
yeah.
is in a greenhouse. And so Karen says the seeds were 4 years from the store and did the germination test and 0%. So
Yeah, and again,
it's
you just don't know how long they've been sat at a warehouse in a sack before the store bought them as well. So this is the only thing. This is why there's a section in the book about collecting your own seed, because think about it. This seed is not only going to save you money. You know exactly how old it is. It's already acclimatized to your local climate. These these seeds always do better, especially because they've had no disease or anything like that, because you're
yeah.
only selecting from the best plants, so you're not getting inferior seed to begin with. And as long as you learn to store them correctly, then that seed is going to last you for a long time.
And so Jen is asking, does older seed sometimes yield weaker plants?
To be honest with you, I don't think that's the case. If
Yeah.
it's like a seed in its very existence, if you like, has everything it needs to germinate. So if that seed germinates, it has everything it's need. It's the environment afterward that's going to provide a weaker plant. So it's whether or not you're giving it inconsistent watering, whether the compost has the nutrients it requires for whatever stage that the plant is at. It could be down to light levels, it could be down to temperature. And a weak plant will tend to pick up a disease and pest issues much, much easier than a stronger plant. I don't think the age of seed is anything to go by. After all, if you
No,
think about it, when you think about it,
go ahead.
in the wild, seed will fall off plants or it'll be carried by birds or whatever the case. It'll land on the floor. That seed might be covered over and not germinate for a couple of years, and eventually the conditions are right and it'll go into life, and then the next thing you know, you've got an oak tree that's like 200 years old. So I don't think the age of the seed is anything to go by.
No, the genetics within the seed will determine how strong the plant is. And if there's enough energy, like you say, if there's enough energy in the seed for it to germinate, then photosynthesis and genetics take over from that point.
Yeah.
And the plant will be as strong as new seed or old seed.
The
It
genetics
really
are the
isn't much
important thing,
different.
and that's how, like, if anyone's seen my channel and you've seen me holding my 67-pound cabbage or my 131-pound zucchini, or my 27-pound cucumber, then that's all about genetic in the seed. It's not just about the way you grew it. It's like anything else. If someone, like, if a human being is born with genetics, of like big strong people, they're going to have that genetic and the ability to get big and strong.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing.
Yeah, I tried growing giant pumpkins when I was at the school garden, and had people come to me after I got one that was close to 100 pounds the first
Yeah.
year we tried, and people saying, "How do you get these pumpkins so big? I water and water and water and fertilize, and I can never get my pumpkins that big." And it's because I bought special seed that
That's right.
produces 100-pound pumpkins.
Yeah,
And
and that's
it's
what it
that
is. It's
simple.
all about the genetics.
So now David's asking about temperature. We were talking about seed storage. What temperatures do you recommend, or what do your books
So
say
it
about
depends on the
storage?
seeds. I mean, I'll just keep them sort of way above freezing, sort of around about 8-10 degrees centigrade. So I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. But basically, you want to keep them frost-free, cool, and dark. Okay. Now, there are some seeds that you can put in the fridge, and they'll be fine in the crisper drawer of the fridge, and they'll be fine in there. And there are other seeds then that you can go and freeze. But there are way it's a lot harder to take seeds down that route of freezing. You've got to really have the setup right and everything else. And it's how the big seed banks and stuff will do it. They will, really bring the temperatures down gradually on the seed, and eventually they can store them over a longer period of time. But here I just keep it around about between 8 and 10, and cool and dark, and they're quite happy there. Being able to breathe is an important thing. People are putting them in plastic bags and stuff like that. Well, that's just asking that bag to sweat and produce mold and what have you. So allowing them to breathe. Paper envelopes, paper bags, those sort of things, great for storing seed in.
Yeah. I did that tour of the seed vault here in Colorado a couple of months ago, and they're just doing cool, dark, dry situation, and 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit is a good target. And I'm a little bit warmer than that, but we
can't always get the ideal conditions, Scott, and
exactly
it's about getting as close to that. Like I said, like we were talking about earlier on, you find a baseline that works and you try and stretch from it. So if you haven't got that conditions, then you need to come as close to it as you can, see if it works. If it don't work, then you've got to find an alternative,
Yeah, my seeds are about 60 degrees, 15 Celsius, and like I said, I'm germinating the basil seeds 2 years past what is recommended that you can get, and that's really what it's all about.
And I'm sure there'll be people who are keeping them at 20 degrees and who will be able to germinate them for some time, But ideally, you want to try and get them down around 8-10 degrees.
Yeah, Celsius,
yeah. Yeah, don't do it Fahrenheit.
45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit is what that range looks like. So Chelsea May is asking this question, and you mentioned about your old videos being in a different garden, and my videos of the last 3 years are at a different garden. Any advice on moving your garden? Chelsea's planning to move in August or September and trying to figure out how to do it.
Okay, so first things first. With all of your fruit bushes, your fruit trees, things like that, anything or any other bushes that you've got, if you're talking about an ornamental garden, then you need to wait till they go dormant. You start tugging at them when they are growing and they've got the sap up in the branches, then you're going to be asking for trouble, and you'll probably lose quite a lot of them. If it's the only option you have to, though, say you're moving in August and it's either a case of leaving them or taking them, well, you might want to take that chance. But ideally, if you can wait for those trees and bushes and things to go dormant, great. Then you've got to dig them up, make sure you've got a good root ball when you dig them up, wrap them in hessian. I don't know if you have hessian out there, like burlap.
Oh, burlap,
yeah. Okay, so wrap them in that, make sure they've had a good watering, tie them up, keep that root ball nice and tight, and they will last you then fine, because the tree is already dormant at that point and you've got time to move them. The things like the plants and stuff that you've got there, they're a lot more tender, so you may want to be thinking about taking cuttings of those and propagating rather than pulling the plant itself. So it really depends on what you're trying to move and the amount of work you want to do as well, and whether or not you want to leave, like a building site of a garden for the next person,
Yeah.
So,
well, and knowing now, it actually makes a big difference. I've moved a number of gardens over the years, and I'm still growing the same raspberry, still growing the same strawberry, still growing the same rhubarb, still growing the same horseradish, literally the same plants that I've been growing for 20 years. Because this time of year, I am doing exactly what you're saying. I would propagate knowing that a move was coming. I would dig up plants and as they were dormant and put them into pots and then just grew them in the container over the course of the summer and then moved them with me. And like the strawberries and any other plant that it's going to propagate. Those are quite
easy to move in, yeah.
So easy. You just, as the runners go out, you just put them in a pot and let them root, and then you move your strawberries. So think about the propagation now in preparation for the move in those many months. And at it's work. You're right. It's how much effort you want to go into it. But I love love having the same plants now that I had 20 years ago.
Well, I've moved my fruit garden now 3 times in the last 12 years, but I'd moved it twice within the space of 3 years, if you get my drift.
Hmm.
And the rhubarb plants that I nearly broke the world record with last year, they are the same rhubarb plants that came with me from there. And I literally just dug out the tubers, cut it up, and replanted. I got a video on that. And this is the thing, people think that because it's there, more often than not, it's down to the effort someone wants to put in. Because you could literally take the entire garden if you wanted to put that effort in, and including the grass, But
Yeah.
it's just that people don't want to put that effort in. Now, for me, it would be more of a case of I have a pear tree that was my granddad's. He died a few years ago. I took it from his garden when he was ill about 10 years ago because he moved in with my mum. So that's like quite an important tree to me. And I thought I'd lost it last year, and I had to
Oh,
cut it right back, and it threw off a load of new growth. So we managed to bring it back. It wasn't the shape that it was, but that tree has moved with me, through each garden, and it's
oh,
now at
nice.
this garden. So if it's something of like sentiment value, or something, someone's bought you a specific plant and you can't take a cutting from it, then it's worth taking the chance of moving it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lily's wondering about saving seeds. Uh, do you need to leave the plant in the ground until the seed pods completely dry out, or can you pull the plant out when the seed pods are still green, specifically with pak choi?
So we talk about this because I'm in quite a wet climate here. Wales is very wet. We get very high rainfall, and sometimes you don't have a long enough season from when the seed starts to produce for it to dry on the plant. So what we do then, especially if it's to do with like vegetables and things like that, we dig the plant up. When we'd wait for the seed to swell as much as it could, then we would dig the plant up and hang the plant upside down in a dry area, so like a shed or something like that, that's still quite bright. And what will happen then, that seed then will dry on the plant hanging upside down, but the plant itself will start drying out, drying the seed, and you
Hmm.
won't lose none of the seed that way. But it's always best to leave it on the plant if you've got dry conditions.
Yeah, I've done what you're talking about doing as well. If I leave the seed pods on the plant and allow them to dry on the plant, germination is
Much better.
95 to
Yeah.
100%. Whereas if you harvest when it's still green and try to get that last little bit of
It's
ripening, you won't have as good
No,
viability.
it's not ideal, but
Yeah,
sometimes, remember I was saying, it depends on your climate, it depends on the year. I mean, here last year we had heat over 40 degrees Celsius for about a 2 week period. We never had that, and then like in the winter it was raining then all through August, September, and
yeah.
October. Well, you ain't drying any seed on the plant then like that. So you got to think, right? Okay, do I just write off saving seed altogether, or do I try? And like I said, we've literally done that a few times. We'll hang them up in the polytunnel. On the rails of the polytunnel, fabulous way of drying the seed. But you need to wait for that seed to mature before you do that. So as long as the plant is still growing, then
Hmm.
you can leave it go till they're fully formed, and then as a last resort, hang it up, if the weather's not conducive.
And so 40 degrees Celsius is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's pretty
We
toasty.
we never seen that heat here.
Yeah.
And the best thing was I was away on holiday up in West Wales. We were just taking a break with the kids, and it was just after composting masterclass had come out in June. So it came out on May the 13th, and in the June we were up there, and that's when we had that heat. It was crazy.
Uh,
So for a whole week during that weather, my garden had no water other than what was already in the ground.
I've lived here in Colorado for 26 years now, and I can remember it was about 15 years ago. Uh, in all of the recorded meteorological history, there had only been one day above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 38 Celsius.
I don't
And
think we've ever had it here in Wales.
well, but 15 years ago, things changed, and we had 1 week where we had three temperatures that were that hot. And now every summer, we can expect half a dozen days that
Well,
are that hot.
this
So,
climate change, maybe your Colorado will get cold and we'll start getting the heat of you, and people will be coming here on holiday.
it's crazy. So here's an interesting question. Clayton's Adventures is wondering, is vacuum sealing seed a good way to store it?
It's not something I've tried.
I would
I
probably
don't see it being
caution
a
against
problem.
it. I'm
I
thinking
wouldn't do it, but I don't see it being a problem.
I'm not sure that it would be a problem, but a seed is alive,
Yeah.
and I don't know how much oxygen it needs. Very minimal amount, but there are just so it's
But you
easier
could
to
use a
store
vacuum
seed.
sealer. You could use the vacuum sealer as just a sealer rather than the vacuum.
Right.
And it's like these foil bags that you now get seed in, So
Yeah.
if you're using just as a sealer that is holding a little bit of moisture in, I think the danger there is to seal it's going to need to be in plastic. And if there's any moisture in that air that's inside, that could potentially grow mold. So I don't know. I have used a dryer to dry seed, mind. So, and that's worked really well
Okay.
on the
Yeah.
lowest setting.
Yeah. The dried. Yeah. If you were to seal it while it was still wet, you'd definitely have an issue with it.
Yeah.
It's just so much easier to store in other ways. So are
Well,
we getting
dry
some
it off and
feedback?
put it in a jar if you were that worried about it, I think sometimes, people look for new ways of doing something, forgetting the always work. And and like I said, I'm guilty of it myself, because I tried drying seeds mainly for an experiment, like I said about experimenting, in a dehydrator on its lowest setting, and it worked fantastic. I had no issue with germination a year later, and but I know people who've tried it on higher heat settings, trying to dry them faster, and it's killed the seed. Yeah. So
I think we may have talked about this when I was on your show last, and I don't know if it's coming through on your end, but I can hear some feedback. I don't know if I'm on your speakers.
Hang on, let me. I'll put these earphones on now, mate. I should connect to it. Bear with me 1 second.
No problem. But we'll talk about raspberries. And Blue Veil Meadows is asking, my patch got overgrown, so I mowed it off in the late fall. Was that bad?
Sorry, mate. Babe, give me 1 second. Right.
So I'll go.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So what was the question?
And so Blue Veil Meadows has raspberries and mowed it off in late fall. Was that bad?
Depends on the raspberry. If it is an autumn-bearing raspberry, it will make absolutely no difference to the plants at all. They'll throw up their new canes this year and they'll fruit this year. If it was summer raspberries, summer-bearing or June-bearing raspberries, whatever you want to call them, then you're going to have a problem, because they fruit on last year's growth. And if you've mowed that down, you've got no last year's growth, there'll be no fruit. They'll still probably throw up new canes, but then there'll be no fruit on them until next year.
Until next year. Yeah, so check out what variety you have. I'm growing heritage raspberries, and I can chop my heritage raspberries down to the ground every year because they're fall bearing and they'll fruit on the primal cane.
And I'm the same on my raspberries, but I've got blackberries next to them, and I can't cut them down because they are the same as the ever bearing. They need they need the following year to fruit.
Yeah. Most blackberries, at least all the blackberries that I've seen in my garden, are second year fruiting.
Yeah.
And so you have to be very selective as to what you're pruning out, and it's extra work, but I love blackberries.
But an easy tip there is, you'll see The canes are very woody on old growth, and they like a pale green to a pale brown on new growth. So you'll see the difference between them. And all you got to do is look at the top of them, and you'll see the spent flower heads where the fruit used to be, and you'll know which ones are fruited, so you can cut them out.
Yeah. Amy's wondering about categories of veggies. You have to worry about cross-pollination if you're going to save the seed and making sure you get the same as mother plant. So in other words, avoiding hybrids. How do you approach your cross-pollination?
Right. So, I mean, ideally, in an ideal world, every plant would be pollinated, with itself. So it'd be grown just by itself, or the flower would be isolated after pollination. And that's what you would do if you were breeding a specific variety to try and cross-pollinate. You would seal it, like when I was growing the giant zucchinis, I'd literally hand pollinate those, and then I would tie the flower to stop pollination. But in reality, in a normal garden, you ain't going to worry about that. The fact is, cross-pollination happens, but it's unlikely. You can spread the crops that you're growing. So you could put, like, if you're going to have courgettes and squash, you just split them apart from each other. So it's less likely that the bee will go from one to the other. That's probably the easiest way of dealing with it. Unless you want to net everything, but then you have problems because you've got to hand pollinate.
Yeah, that's my primary method. I time it exactly that way. So the zucchini or courgette, I'll start first if I want to save seed from that, and then I give it a couple weeks, and then I'll start a different squash or pumpkin. And that first zucchini is growing, and it has never been exposed to cross-pollination. The key is that's the one you save your seed from. People think they have to wait till the end of the season to save seeds, but if you're worried about cross-pollination,
you select the plant.
Select the plant, and then select that very first fruit that hasn't been cross-pollinated, and that's the one that you actually want to save your seed from.
I mean, you're seeing these flowers open, so as soon as it's been pollinated, you can do a number of things. You can tie the flowers shut if they're big flowers, like on zucchinis and things. Literally just get a piece of cord and tie it shut so nothing else can get in there. Or another thing you can do is pull the petals off that flower, because then the bees are not attracted to it, or lacewings, whatever it is that's coming to pollinate. They're not attracted to that particular one. They're more likely to go somewhere else because you've pulled all the petals off the flowers.
Yeah, it's a little bit of work, but if you're saving the seed and don't want that concern, those are the kind of things you need to do.
And if you're only looking for like one or two plants to save seed, you could just hand pollinate them, just net them, and just hand pollinate them, and that way you're guaranteed that you're going to have proper seed coming from that.
Yeah, I actually have a video programmed for the June or July timeframe where I'll be showing all of these things that we've been talking about, to include covering the plants and hand pollinating and scheduling different and all that kind of fun stuff. So look for that video in a couple months. David Souza, thank you so much for that super chat. My second year gardening, could not have done it without you, Gardener Scott. Well, thank you for that. Looking forward to the journey. And it is a great journey. And, check out Tony's channel if you haven't yet, David. The Simplified Gardening channel has got hundreds of videos, just like I've got hundreds of videos. And especially, I will say, Tony, and I know you're aware of this, but you, I think, have become kind of the potato expert on YouTube. I don't know if
I don't know how that happened.
I don't know if anyone else has as many views on their potato videos as you do. And you've got a lot of potato videos, and you've got some very successful potato crops that you harvest.
I think I'm pushing around about 17 million views on the potato videos, so they do okay.
Yeah, you know a thing or two about and I have to be careful. I don't like to copy anybody else's channels, but I've just made a handful of potato videos, but I've had to watch your potato videos to make sure that I'm not copying you when I make my videos, because you're so thorough in everything you cover. I'm trying to be original as much as I can.
Yeah, but I mean, we're in an industry now, or a niche, if you like, that I'm not, it's not like I'm the first guy to grow potatoes. I mean, every gardener grows potatoes. I suppose I'm just the one that, tries to sort of get the information across in a way that people can actually get results. And like, there is so many people now making, like 12 years ago when I first come on the scene saying, grow your potatoes in containers, people were
Hmm.
pulling their head out at me, like, and now it seems to be everywhere. You can't turn YouTube on now without seeing someone sowing potatoes in buckets and containers and everything else. And for me, that's great, because it's hard for them to say that a process doesn't work when you're pulling 15 pounds of potatoes out of a 30-litre container in front of their
Yeah,
eyes,
yeah,
and it's enabled a lot of people who have pest issues with like wireworm and stuff to actually produce quite a substantial crop. And even when I was ill with vertigo, I still pulled out 235 pound of potatoes out of containers that I hadn't watered all year. So, the methods speak for themselves with it. And I think that's why the videos have done so well.
oh, it works. I had a really nice surprise yesterday. As a matter of fact, I did that video a few weeks ago. I've started my potatoes early in grow bags, and it's still way too cold outside. We're still dipping down, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, about -7 Celsius overnight. And so I've had my grow bags indoors, and I walked by it yesterday, and my potato plants are already sprouting.
Yeah,
And
I had a
so
couple through as well.
I've had to start moving them out into the sun and back as of yesterday because they need more light than I can give them indoors. But they work in containers. If
Yeah.
you haven't
And
done it, you should all do it.
and the great thing about it is, as I've gone on through years, because when if I was young when I first started gardening, but now, I'm 48 now, and I'm feeling the garden, especially because of my job. And it's so much easier than digging trenches and putting them in and then digging them out and ruining potatoes with a fork because you can't get them out without stabbing them. And you know, I literally just chuck a bit of compost in, put some spuds in, fill it completely in. So I'm not like, it's not like I'm going back there and having to hoe up the potatoes on a regular basis. It's one job and done. All I got
Yeah.
to do is water and feed. And then at the end of it, I cut off the tops, wait a couple of weeks, tip them into a wheelbarrow, pull them out, store them. I'm done. There's no hard work. And I got all this fantastic compost to use because the compost I use them. One of the things, I think one of the biggest things that people say to me is, "Oh God, that must cost a fortune to do." And initially, there's a cost to buy the containers, right? There's no getting away from that, and you can buy them over the years. But all of mine are all filled with homemade compost, or
Hmm.
last year I did a trial with peat free because the UK are banning peat, so it's a nightmare, and the quality of compost is absolutely hit rock bottom.
Wow.
And I'd done a trial last year, and I grew all of my potatoes in this peat free and various. I think I'd done something like about 19 different brands of peat free compost, and I had real poor performance. And it
That's
was
too bad.
all about testing that, and I was fine because, like I said, you know. Sometimes we have to test, especially what it's like, Scott, when you're making videos and things like that. You sort of want to be able to show people what's going on. So that's what I did. But I'm back to my own compost this year. That's for
Okay.
sure.
And I like you, I reuse it. I make my own and then reuse it. And I wasn't going to do potatoes this year, but I used my compost or potting soil that I had in containers to amend the soil in my greenhouse.
Yeah.
And so last year I thought I had harvested all the potatoes from the year before, but there were some little baby potatoes hidden in that compost. And so I actually started growing potatoes in my greenhouse unexpectedly. and harvested those in November and December, and that's what I'm using for seed potatoes. So not only can you reuse it, but it may give you some surprises with the plants that'll pop up.
Sometimes the volunteer potatoes are the amazing things. Like last January, I was harvesting compost out, and in the August, I chucked a lot of potato peelings in it, but I hadn't had a cover on the top of this compost because I was really just storing stuff there. And some of these potatoes started to grow, so I just left them grow. And when I came to harvest the compost in the January, I just set the camera up because I wanted the footage of me taking the compost out so I could promote composting masterclass. And I'm pulling this out, and I pulled 71 pound of potatoes out of the compost bin. And there's a video of it on the website. It's amazing, like just all from potato peelings. So sometimes the volunteer plants can really save you, like, you know.
That's funny. So Yankee Sister Homestead is asking, when you stack your potatoes in containers, should they be the same variety?
Only if you want to know what potatoes you're actually growing. If you're just going to do it so you can eat yourself, then it doesn't really make much of a difference. But ideally, when I'm harvesting my potatoes, all one variety goes in one container to store, or however I'm going to store it. Another variety will go elsewhere because I want to keep the potato varieties so that I'm not mixing them within the buckets when I'm growing the next year. I want to be able to say, oh, I'm growing Charlotte or I'm growing Yukon Gold year, or whatever the case being, you know. And because when people see like a massive harvest, you know, you tip a bucket out and there's like 17 pound of spuds. Everybody wants to know what brand of potato, you know, what variety of potato it is. Well, it's a bit hard if you don't know then. But if I was just eating, well, really doesn't make much of a difference unless the texture of the potato is different and you want it for a specific purpose. You know, that's the only thing I would really worry about with it.
Yeah, because this year I'm growing a mixture of potatoes that just popped up. I don't have as many seed potatoes as some varieties, and I mixed them. I've got one of my grow bags that's got 2 or 3 different varieties, but that's because I just had a couple seed
and that's
potatoes.
Fine.
They'll be fine.
And, you know, like I said, and I think as you get better at gardening and you know the variety of potatoes you're growing, you can tell them apart. I can put like 5 different red skinned potatoes in front of me that I've grown, and I know exactly what variety it is because I've been doing it for so long. I know exactly how that potato comes out of the ground. I know the color of it. I know the texture of the skin. I know, you know, so, you know, when you're doing that, then you can say, oh, you know, that's a Rudolph, that's a Sapo, whatever the case being, you know.
Nice. So Shandy's Garden is wondering about the cut seed potatoes. They've been chitting their potatoes. They've gotten super dark and starting to look bad, but waiting for the cold to pass. What's the lowest temperature? And you can give it in Celsius, and I'll convert it, that you can sow or put your potatoes out.
If you're putting them outside, it doesn't make a difference, even if you're still having frosts. Put them outside about 4 weeks before your last frost, and all that will do, the soil will stop that frost from killing off any of the sprouts that are coming through. Okay, it acts like a blanket for them. The only time you don't want any frost is when they start poking their head through the soil. So if you want to cover them over, that's great. But when you say they're starting to look dark, and I mean, when you cut a potato anyway, it always turns grey and starts looking sort of dark and stuff. But as long as you've got a sprout on that potato that's actually grown, that potato has done its job. You could literally snap that sprout off and just grow the sprout. You don't need the potato at that point. It's just a storage chamber for energy. So as long as that potato's is not rotting, then there is no issue with it. You can just keep it in a bright, cool place, you know, sort of 8-10 degrees, you know, for chitting them, and just leave them there until you're ready to go. And funny enough, I pulled potatoes that I chitted last January out of my shed this year, and they were still there. And although the potato had all shriveled up, the sprouts were still viable on it. It was amazing. So they
Wow.
will last. Even though you've cut them, don't worry about it going all dark and looking funky. As long as there's no mold and there's no squishy, soft. The potato can shrivel up and everything. It doesn't make a difference to that. As long as that sprout is formed, then you're golden. You're done.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just lost it. Brian was asking a question about leeks and going to seed and wondering if they're biennial, if they take 2 years like onions do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly the same thing. So leeks exactly like onions, and they'll flower in the second year. So and this is like onion sets, if you like. This is why people's onion sets will bolt in the first year, because that onion thinks it's in its second year. With leeks, it's a bit different because you don't use a set, but again, it's a biannual plant, so it will come through the first year fine, and then in the second year, it'll start throwing up a big scape, and you'll have a seed head on the top of it. And in fact, I got a big, huge tray about. You can't even show you on this screen. Big tray full of leek heads that I've cut off to collect the seed, and it's been drying in my shed since last sort of August. I've not got around to
Nice.
sort of dealing with it. So
Nice. I left some onions in my garden this year for that purpose. I'll be
yeah,
harvesting my onion seeds this year from the ones that I planted
and
last year.
like if you're in a damp climate like the UK, you don't even need to leave them in the ground. You can lift them, you can cut the roots off them, you can cut the tops off them, and then when it comes to early spring, you can replant that onion just like you would an onion set, and that
Yeah.
onion will then go off. If it starts to rot on the outside, just peel the outer layers off it, and it doesn't matter how small that goes, because all you wanted to do is throw that flower spike if you want it for seed. And I often put old onions that I haven't eaten that started going a little bit soft in my flower
Oh
border,
yeah.
and I'll let them go to seed. It's a great way of attracting bees in, and they give a lot of texture within the flower beds and things like that. So
Nice idea. Now, for those of you who don't know, Tony actually has a real job, like most YouTubers. He has continual employment to pay for everything he's doing on YouTube,
yeah,
and so he's got to leave us here in just a couple minutes. And so let's finish, Tony. I'll stick around to answer questions, and Tony's actually going to be listening in his car as he drives to work. But what's coming next? You've written the composting book. You've written this wonderful book on your first vegetable garden. And I've got a link to this below for anyone that wants to check it out. What's coming next?
well, before you go on to that, just to let your viewers know, there's actually two versions of this book.
Right.
There's a UK version, which is that one. So there's a UK version, you can see the star on the front there, and obviously a USA version, which is what Scott has got there. So when you go onto Amazon or wherever you're going to buy your bookstores, make sure you get the right version. Look for that star if you're in the UK or any European country, or anywhere else. Then you don't need to worry about the star. I got a third book which I wrote. It's in the process of it's with the publisher at the moment, so they're doing their work on it. They've done the first sort of basic layout of it and everything, and I've had some proofs back at that. But this book won't be coming out till next year at some point. And that's all about the science behind gardening. So it's a different book entirely. It's not really like composting masterclass or your first vegetable garden. It's not about growing as a fact. It's about more understanding what's happening behind the plants in your garden, why they do certain things. Yeah.
Nice.
So just basically giving people an understanding of how the growth patterns work within them, how they take up nutrients, that sort of stuff. So it's more designed behind that. So it's going to be a completely different book, and it may not be for everybody, because a lot of people don't want to know that information. But anybody who wants to understand the way the garden works, then it'll be an ideal book for them.
I love that stuff. That's one of the things I love both about your composting book and your vegetable garden book is you've got a ton of science packed in, and the cation exchange. I just love that when we deal with soil nutrients and everything else. So I'm looking forward to that book. Well, mate, thank you so much for being on the show today. I know we all enjoyed it, and I'll be looking forward to the next time we have you on.
It's great coming on, and I hope to see you all again very soon. I'm off to work now.
Okay. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks very much, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. So those of you who are familiar with Tony hopefully had another dose of Tony. It's always nice to talk to him. And for anyone that doesn't know Tony, I did put links below to his YouTube channel and his book. I'm still going to be around for the next half hour. Let's go ahead and get to a question from Jenny Simon. Can you explain the difference between soil and soilless potting mix? Great question. Compost equals soilless, I read. So when Tony talks about using compost as he's growing his plants, in the UK, compost is synonymous with what we in the US would call potting soil. Potting soil generally has no soil in it. It's a soilless mix. And so what that means is there are no minerals. If you think of soil, think about the plains, the mountains, all that rocky material, the small particles. That's the soil that we all live and walk on. Well, the soilless mixes have none of that. It's usually peat moss or cocoa coir. It's got composted material in it. It might have manures of some type, but the soilless mixes have no actual soil in them. And so that's the big difference. Soil has the broken down minerals. It's got organic matter. It's got soil life in it. And so soilless mixes typically don't have a lot of bacteria. They don't have that fungi until it's been exposed to the environment. And when we grow our seeds indoors, we are typically using a soilless mix. Excuse me. And one of the reasons for that is we don't want all that bacteria and potentially harmful fungi. And so as you'll see from the videos I've done on making mixes, and I've got a few different recipes that I show in my videos, I'm not adding my garden soil to my soilless mixes because I want to maintain that environment without those kind of problems in it. And so can you use compost in seed starting cells and house plants? Yes, you can. So when I talk about compost, I'm talking about composted organic materials, materials that have decomposed and are added to soil or added to the other ingredients in a soilless mix, like the perlite and the peat moss and worm castings and whatever else it happens to be. I do not suggest using straight compost for seed starting, and that's either a potting soil or composted material. The seed starting material should be as light as possible. It needs no nutrients, like Tony was talking about. The seed has everything it needs to grow. And so you want to give a nice, loose, moist environment for that seed to start growing. And you really don't need compost or potting soil for that seed to start. It can be just a simple blend like I do of peat moss and perlite. Once it starts growing, then those roots and the plant need nutrients. And that's where the soilless mix comes back into the picture, because most of those potting soils will have the nutrients, either in the form of compost or worm castings or fertilizers that have been added to it. Outside, when you start your seed and they start growing, the roots are now getting all the nutrients from the soil that has the organic matter in it, and it's the soil life that makes the nutrients available. So, quick, dirty answer, but of course I've got videos that discuss soil much more in depth that you can look into if you were wondering about that. So I know that question came from a little while ago. Sherry's wondering about what's a good place to buy grow bags. I have a couple videos with grow bags, and I actually get them from different sources. So if you look at some of my container videos, there's some links in there. Gardzin, I think, is one of the links that I have in my videos, and that they just go to Amazon. I get a lot of what I get from Amazon. If you can find them on sale at a local nursery, then I strongly suggest buying local and getting them locally if you can. Uh, the quality I'm finding is pretty comparable. The cheap bags are a little thinner than the more expensive bags, but even the cheap ones I bought years ago are still holding up. They're still durable. And so just do a search or click on one of my links in one of my videos and buy what you can afford and go with grow bags. I think that's one of those things that I strongly encourage if you're trying to expand your gardening world. Catherine, thank you for that super chat. Gardner Scott and Tony O'Neill. Are sweet potatoes and regular potatoes compatible? I accidentally planted them together. They're two completely different types of plants. And so if they are compatible from the perspective that they're not going to cause harm or damage to each other. They're not going to really create any problems. It's just that they grow similarly with the part that's underground. So if they're planted too close together, then yes, they can interfere with each other. And the sweet potatoes, depending on the variety and your soil, the sweet potatoes may grow bigger than the potatoes underground. And so it's possible that those sweet potato roots can push out those potato tubers, and the potatoes might end up being a little bit smaller. The plant itself is also different. And so the potato plant is a little more upright. It's in the tomato nightshade family, so it has upward growth, whereas the sweet potato is a vine that can sprawl across the ground. So it's possible that the sweet potato plant can cover up the potato plant. So you do need to be aware of that. So they can grow together in the same bed. Just be aware that the way they grow might interfere with the other plant. And so you might need to get in there and do some selective pruning to make sure you don't have a problem like that in the future. Shandy's Garden is saying, I'm planting 25 pink Hopi popcorn right next to 25 ambrosia sweet yellow corn. Good for you. You know, I've seen mixed results on this, and even some of the university study that I've read, some of the research is mixed. You don't need to worry about cross-pollination if you're not saving the seed. That's one of the biggest issues people have. But I have seen some information that does say, even though you want to have lots of pollen to pollinate all of the corn, that the sweet corn can affect some other corns. So I would say if that's the space you're growing your corn, go ahead and grow the corn. You may get inconsistent kernels on the corns or on the cobs, and it's possible you might notice a difference in the way that those corn plants are growing. But I've grown different types of corn side by side and never really had much of an issue before. And I continue to do that. Gardens Happen saying, a real job, something only heard of in myths and fairy tales. So for those of you that don't know, Tony O'Neill is a firefighter. And so when he goes to work, he's often at work for a couple days straight, living at the firehouse. And then he comes home and he's off for a period of days and then starts it all over again. So yes, I would say that Tony has a real job, and it's one of those things that all of us that have a job, it's a real job of one form or another, but Tony is definitely serving and taking it to another level, if you ask me. And so it was always great to have him on the show, especially since he was going to work. If you are watching in replay, you can actually see he's got his fire shirt on because he was literally going to work as soon as we were finishing up today. So, okay, I'm scrolling down. I'm going to try to catch up with some of what I might have missed. And it looks like the question came up again about the popcorn and the sweet potato or sweet corn. You can grow them together You just would have better results if you can grow them separately. But it's one of those things, again, in all of our gardens, you've got to grow what you've got space for and what you can fit into that space. And sometimes it might not be best for pollination, but you've got to do what you've got to do with what you want to grow and where you are. Thank you, Colorado Bird Nerd. Great to have you here today. The maturity date confuses me. Is that from the day it sprouts as a seedling? So yes, generally when you see a seed packet and it tells days to maturity or days to harvest, that's based on when the plant is growing. Now, I've seen some companies that are starting to add in some extra time. So they'll say, sow 3 weeks before the last frost date, and then they'll say harvest 3 months from sowing. That's unusual because most of the seed companies do not take into account the time that the seed needs to germinate. And it's all about the soil temperature, it's all about the type of seed. Some seeds can germinate in a couple days, some seeds can take a month before they'll germinate. There are a lot of factors involved. So that's why most seed companies will begin the clock after the plant is actively growing. It holds true with tomatoes as an example. If you are growing a tomato plant and it says 80 days to harvest, well, that's 80 days from when you are putting the plant into the ground. So if you start your tomato seeds 6 to 8 weeks before you want to transplant them, that 6 to 8 weeks is not built into that days to harvest or maturity date. All of those dates are when the plant is in your garden, outside, actively growing, and those are the time frames that you'll see printed on a seed packet. Now we talked about the other factor, which is if everything works the way it's supposed to work. So in an ideal garden with the warm temperatures, the soil was right when you planted it, the plant's getting all the nutrients it needs, and the seed packet says it's 80 days to harvest or 80 days to maturity, that's what it's based on. Everything being right. If you've had bad weather or some kind of problem that comes into the picture, it may take longer than that. So it's a guideline, and hopefully that helps clear it up a little bit. It's a guideline for general planning. Don't send a nasty letter, not that you would, but don't send a letter to the seed company saying it's day 80 and I'm not ready to harvest yet. That's because your weather is probably different than what their testing was showing. And so it's just a general guideline to get you headed in the right direction so you know when to start looking for that harvest or when the plant is mature enough that you can start harvesting the leaves or the roots in particular. And so you'll often see days to maturity on a plant like carrots or beets where you can't see the root growing underground. And you'll see days to harvest on the plants that are growing above ground with a fruit. And it's a guideline to tell us when to start harvesting. I aim for that date, especially with my root vegetables. And at about the 80-day point or whatever it happens to be, I'll dig up one plant. And if the root is big enough, now it's time to harvest. If it still needs more time, then I leave it in the ground, maybe give it a week, come back the next week, dig up a single carrot and see how big it is. And that's really how I approach my harvest. It's actually getting out in the garden and taking a look to see if the plants are telling me that it's time to harvest. And so use that date, put it on your calendar so you don't forget about your plants. I've done that too many times where I forgot that the 80 days is up and I go out and it's been 100 days and now some of the roots or some of the plants are a little over mature. So definitely stay on top of things if you can. Okay, scrolling down again, trying to catch up. So nice to see everybody here today. Good information. I know you guys aren't doing a lot of talking when Tony and I are doing talking. And I appreciate that. During most of our live streams, there's a lot of questions and answers being passed back and forth. So it's nice that we had your attention today, because I can see once Tony left that some of that conversation is going back and forth. Wasabi Gal's got 0.4 inches from breaking the Duluth snowfall record, and it's almost worth all the shoveling. That's nice. I wish we had as much snow. We actually had one of the driest Marches on record here, so we haven't had nearly as much snow as we would like. Had a little bit of snow this last week. It was a wet snow, but hope we can get some of that snow before the season's over. I got about a month, almost exactly a month until my last frost date, and it's totally normal for me in Colorado to have at least one more, maybe even 2 or 3 snowfalls between now and the last frost date, and maybe even after the last frost date. So keeping the fingers crossed, but we haven't had much rain. I'm hoping for it. We'll have to wait and see. At Home with Cherie says, I think many companies also base the harvest date based on their climate. Here in colder climates, I found I sometimes need an extra couple weeks to reach harvest. Zone 7 versus Zone 4 is different. Absolutely. And you know, that's one of the things I was talking about. I've shown in some of my videos from the last couple years where I'm doing more and more measuring of my soil temperature, because that plays a bigger role than you might expect. The last frost date is just a date on the calendar, and the seed packet will tell you when to plant, before or after, but the soil temperature has a huge effect on the germination. And so that's actually one of those things, and I'm glad that you saw that, Cherie, that it's your garden's reaction to your climate that will affect how your plants grow. And if you recognize that you need to add a week or 2 to what the seed packet says, now that's in your bag of tricks, and you can use that for every year afterwards and refine it as needed. But I do the same thing. Even though I try to put the plants in the ground and give myself about a 2-week buffer after the last frost date for the soil to warm up, I still typically add another week just to be on the safe side. So when I'm growing an 80-day tomato, meaning I should be able to harvest in 80 days, it's really 90 days for me for planning purposes, which is why I'm not growing the big beefsteaks that are 110 days, because my season's just not long enough for that, because I built into that buffer. And I strongly suggest that you look into those kind of variations within your garden. Put it in your garden journal, keep track of it, and before you know it, you'll have it figured out. If you're beginning with the gardening, the process is modifying each year what you're doing in your garden, and part of that modification is the timing of when you put the seeds in the ground, or when you transplant, and when you harvest. And that will really help you choose the right kind of varieties to match your garden. Because if you're trying to grow something, Tony said he was trying to grow okra a couple years ago. He didn't tell us the results, but that's because I'm guessing he didn't have a lot of success with okra. You don't hear a lot about okra growing in the UK because it can be challenging in cool, wet conditions. And I stopped growing it here in my Colorado garden because it's just too cold at the beginning of the season, at the end of the season, for me to have a good, successful okra crop. Well, you don't know that until you try it, because you can look at a seed packet and it says I could grow okra, but in practice, it's just too much work and I don't get the good results I want. So start keeping track of those kind of things and anticipate this year how you're going to approach your gardening. If you're experimenting, like I always encourage, and you're trying new varieties, well, make note of how well they do and how they differ from some of the other varieties that you've been growing. And that's how you end up having the perfect garden with the plants that do well every year. It's from throwing out the ones that don't work and keeping the ones that do work. And we were talking about seeds earlier, saving your own seeds, because the plants that do best in your garden are probably the plants you should be saving the seeds from, so that you can continue that success rate as the years move forward. So I still have lots of seeds I've been saving over the years, and those are the seeds that I prefer to plant. I love buying seeds. I love trying new things, but it's those seeds that I know will work that I'm saving for that reason exactly. So at home with Cherie says I have to start earlier. My first year I got snow and freeze before my cabbages and other things were ready. I should have just harvested small. Live and learn. Absolutely. Seth is saying, experimenting last year, I found perpetual spinach chard is a better choice than actual spinach for my garden and can be used the same. Great example. I like that. Sometimes the plant is a completely different plant, but you use it the same way and have more success with it. So I love that idea. Dusty Flat says, I hope buds don't freeze as that heat started breaking dormancy. Yeah, I'm having that issue. I've got some plants some of my trees that are just starting to show buds. And I know we've got cold coming. The forecast isn't too bad, but I know we've got cold that's coming, and I don't want my buds damaged either. But that's where protection, throwing plastic over your beds, if you've got that option, really can make a big difference. I'm going to be sowing a lot of seeds, cool season seeds this week, and I've got my hoops in place, and I'll have my plastic ready if we have some of those days that are going to be dropping really cold, which is not completely unusual and out of the question. Before I forget, I want to give a couple shout outs. I think last week, Yankee Sister Homestead gave a super chat just as the show was ending, and I didn't say a thank you, and you know I like to always say thank you, so thank you for that super chat last week if I happen to have missed it. And I saw that Sunset Gazing gave some gift memberships to some people this week as well. So for the membership on the Gardner Scott channel, thank you for doing that, Sunset Gazing. Gardeners are just such giving people and so wonderful. So I appreciate you doing that and spreading that gift for others to help join that membership of the YouTube channel. So I really do appreciate that. And not for my sake, but for just the generosity that you're presenting. That's a great example, and we can all definitely learn from generosity that gardeners in general have. And I saw that from the video that I did over the weekend. I know many of you have probably seen that video, and the kind words, the generosity, the warm feelings, all of that is just so wonderful. And I really feel it, and I thank you so much for doing that. It's one of those things that I in the very beginning, a few people comment, and it happens every week. And Monday is such a great day because we can all get together and we can talk gardening to start our gardening week. And I try to say it as often as I can. I know it's repetitive because I pretty much say it every week, but this really is great. Gardeners are just a wonderful community to be part of, which is why I try to share the information with as many people as possible and encourage that you all do the same thing as you move forward. Get more people involved. Think about this. We have, let me look real quickly. We have right now 240 people that are on the live stream, and it was a little bit more than that earlier. And so if all of us were to find just one person to add to the gardening world this year, and then next year those 500 people add one more, and then the next year, think about how incredible that would be if we were to grow our gardening community just one gardener at a time. And I know a lot of you do that on a regular basis. And so think about that. Maybe take that as one of your gardening goals. Too often we look at gardening as a goal to grow a certain amount of food or a certain type of flower or whatever it happens to be. Well, think about growing your garden as growing your gardening community. Because if you can develop amongst your group of friends and family another gardener, well, now that gives you something to talk about when you get together. It gives you an opportunity to share information back and forth, especially if you're a new gardener and you like buying gardening books like some of the rest of us. That's why I have all of Tony's books, and I've got a lot of other books that I've acquired over the years. Well, if you've got a gardener friend, you can go ahead and share the cost of that book. Hey, I'll buy the composting book by Tony. You buy the vegetable garden book by Tony, and then we'll swap them and we'll each read them. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, to support Tony would encourage that everybody buy their own copy, but the idea is that you can develop your own community and share the information back and forth. And it's so nice. I had a great group of Master Gardener friends I had met through the Master Gardener program, and that was 20 years ago now. And we got together on a regular basis beyond the gardening world to just socialize and talk with spouses and share dinners. And now life gets in the way and kids grow up and people move away. And so our gardening group isn't as big as it was, but we're still all friends and we can still all talk about gardening after all of these years. And it's so wonderful to have that. And much of it is just built from the people you already know, or maybe you don't know as well yet, but gardening gives you the reason to get together and socialize and share your zucchini, and they share their eggplant and whatever happens to be. So I encourage that you add that to your growing plan for this year, is to actually grow your gardening world, and hopefully it can make a difference in their world. And Yankee Sister Homestead says, I've gotten my niece into gardening and she just loves your channel. There you go. Thank you, Yankee Sister. I think that is exactly what I'm talking about. It's one of those things that we can get the family, and I know I talk about my granddaughters. They love coming out to the garden. My grandson's birthday is today. And so he's turned 3. I got him a full set of gardening tools and a book suitable for 3-year-olds that is all about gardening. And so he's got his shovel, and he's got his rake, and he's got a broom, and he's got some smaller handheld tools to use in the garden. I'm starting at 3 years old, and my son is in full support of it. My son in his 30s is just now starting to get into gardening and was never interested in it, but partly because of my channel and partly because he's an adult now with kids, he's recognizing the importance of having a garden of his own. So we talk almost every day, and now we can actually talk gardening in our conversations. And I'm just ecstatic about that. My daughter and I do the same. Just last night, my daughter and I were talking. Gardening was part of the conversation. So think about, especially if you have a friend or a family member and you don't have a lot to talk about, gardening could be the answer. Could be one of those things that breaks the ice and gets you talking. So thank you, Garden State. Gardner, a new member of the Gardener's God channel. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you in the Facebook group and maybe on some of the extra live streams that we have as part of the membership. And Yankee Sister Homestead, always nice to have you here, of course. And thank you for that super chat. Gardeners are great people. They absolutely are. You know, I know I'm biased, but I think gardeners are just about the best people out there. I have my gardening channel, of course, the Gardener's God channel, and I'm trying to remember how many times, I was thinking about this yesterday, I've had thousands and thousands and thousands. I think I've had, I forget the exact number, but close to 100,000 comments on my videos. It might actually be more than that. And in all that time, I can only think of twice that the comment was so negative that I had to delete it, and you know, it really seriously affected me. All the rest are positive. Now, I might get thumbs down on videos. That's fine. I expect that. But even then, most of the time, the comments from gardeners to gardeners is always positive. And I appreciate that. I really appreciate that gardeners overall are nice people, and they want to be nice, and they don't want to say bad things about people. You go to some of the other YouTube channels, and oh, it's terrible that you just don't want to be part of that community because of all the the hate and the discourse that's being spewed on some of those comments. We have none of that. And so I want to thank you for that, because it is so much nicer to just be at peace and be happy and be able to converse without any of those issues. So I think you probably would tend to agree with that, which is why I think growing the gardening community from the inside is really one of the best ways to approach it. And Gardener State Gardener says we need more schools teaching kids how to garden. Absolutely. And that was actually what the conversation was with my daughter last night. Is she works at a school and she's putting together a seed starting exercise for her students, and she was asking me about the seeds and which seeds she should use and whether they should be old seeds or new seeds. And I just love that my own daughter is doing that in a school, educating kids for the future. So completely agree with you. But the issue is often the budget, and schools can't always have a garden program. And so it needs to start at home with someone like you and me that can do that. So next week, of course, we're going to be back with another show, same time on Monday. I'm not having any scheduled guests at that time. You get me for the whole time. We'll be answering lots of questions, talking more gardening topics. I appreciate you being here today and sharing your time with me and Tony O'Neill. And it really is a good book. I really do like it. It is a lot of in-depth knowledge that goes beyond just your first vegetable garden. That's one of the things I think it, in this book in particular, deserves a place in a library as a resource book. Like Tony said, he wrote it so you could come back to it every year, and it really does serve that purpose. So thank you for being here today. Get out there, do some gardening, spread the gardening word, and I'll see you back here next week. And we'll talk more gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. Do enjoy your gardening.